welcome to the show. I'm Sharri Markson. We've got a lot on tonight. I'll expose how Anthony Albanese is reaching into the Kevin 07 playbook during this cost of living crisis. And the feud between Nikki Haley and Donald Trump escalates just a day after his success in Iowa. Also, the punishment that Sonny Bill Williams has faced from Channel 9 for his social media posts denying October 7. All of that coming up. But first tonight, the forensic detail of the profit figures that expose Anthony Albanese on the cost of living crisis and undermine his cynical tactics to turn supermarkets into villains. The Prime Minister seems to have turned to the playbook of his friend and mentor, Kevin Rudd, to pull him out of political quicksand in this cost of living crisis. Albanese is copying one of Rudd's signature moves from during the global financial crisis. A supermarket price inquiry. This move isn't going to tackle the actual cost of living crisis itself, but only Australians' perceptions of who is to blame for life being so unaffordable. Well, as voters turn against Albanese over cost of living, he's looking to pass the buck. He can't blame the RBA governor anymore. They already sacked Philip Lowe, and their own appointee, Michelle Bullock, is now in the chair. So Albanese is looking to turn the supermarket giants into villains. It's why the Prime Minister has been accusing them of price gouging.
My government is concerned about the price of what consumers pay at Coles and Woolies and other supermarkets. We want to make sure that consumers benefit from cheaper prices which are being paid. We're dead serious. We find it completely unacceptable that when supermarkets are getting goods cheaper, the prices should go down.
If this idea all sounds familiar, it is because Kevin Rudd did the exact same thing during the global financial crisis. Rudd, who Albanese, as you know, gave the plum job of Australia's ambassador in Washington, despite denying he was going to do so in opposition. And the idea of an ACCC supermarket price inquiry, old and reheated, is straight from Rudd's playbook. Here's the media release from January 2008 from the Rudd government. It says ACCC inquiry into grocery prices. The Rudd government has today directed the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission to commence a formal inquiry into grocery prices. The Rudd government wants to ensure working families are getting a fair deal at the supermarket. But like many of the gimmicks during the Rudd era, this was a hopeless failure. It didn't find major fault with the grocery supply chain, and it achieved nothing, just like the ridiculed fuel watch. And I remember it all well. I was in the press gallery at the time. But not letting the facts spoil a good announcement, Albanese is now forging on with the same inquiry some 16 years later.
The opposition leader wants consumer watchdog, the ACCC, to investigate the pricing policies of Woolies and Coles and put their prices on a website.
Why? Because our working families need information out there about who's offering the best deal.
Mr Howard needs to take action to relieve the pressure on working families rather than simply tell them that Australian working families have never had it so good.
So instead of Albanese cutting spending or lifting productivity to help curb inflation, he's called on the supermarkets to pass on any savings, to pass on their profits to consumers.
The big supermarket chains have been making record profits, and we know that there's something out of sync there. And we say to all of the supermarkets and to big business, they have a responsibility to look after their customers, and my government is prepared to take whatever action is necessary. It's not acceptable to see record profits at a time when people are doing it so tough.
This very clearly seems to be socialist Albanese coming through. Is the Prime Minister really saying that supermarkets can't have profits now, that their profits have to be passed on to customers? The government has no right to tell companies what prices they should set for products. unless, of course, those industries require government licences to exist, which isn't the case with supermarkets. We do live in a capitalist society. But given this does appear to be what Albanese is arguing, it's worth having a forensic look at just how much money the supermarket giants are actually making. Well, Coles' EBIT margin for the 2023 financial year was 4.8%, and it was down slightly from 5% in 2022. And Woolworths Supermarket, its EBIT margin for the 2023 financial year was 6%. Now, neither of these figures are spectacularly high. Many industries have much higher profit margins, some of 20 or 30%. Now, remember Albanese blamed Scott Morrison for the cost of living crisis in early 2022 when Albanese was in opposition. But now that he's the Prime Minister, well, it was the RBA governor's fault. Now it's the supermarket's fault, and inflation is all because of global factors. Never mind that Michelle Bullock has warned inflation is increasingly homegrown. Now, that's not to say there's not a problem with price gouging for some products, or that there aren't concerns about a duopoly market. It's not to say that it may not be useful to put extra pressure on the supermarkets to help keep prices down. But the suggestion that the supermarkets are to blame for this cost of living crisis is absurd, simplistic, and wrong. The biggest driver of cost of living is the price of energy and fuel, not the meagre profit margins of supermarkets. This isn't a smart economic policy. It's an embarrassing rehash of a populist idea from a failed Prime Minister in a failed government that repeatedly put gimmicks ahead of substance. And now Albanese is using the same tactic to cover for his own failure to make life more affordable, which was his central election promise during the campaign. A promise that, as you know, he's failed on every measure. Sky News host James Morrow and Director of Headline Advisory Andrew Carswell join me now. Good to see you both. Look, I want to get your reaction to this tactic, this clear rehash of a Rudd government policy that Albanese is running. Andrew Carswell, what do you think about this? You were the press secretary for Scott Morrison, so you know how governments might like to have a tendency to choose populist policies, but in a cost of living crisis, this isn't actually going to help anyone have a more affordable way of life.
Well, Sharri, when you go back in time and steal not only a policy from a previous government, but a failed policy of a previous government, you have effectively run out of ideas. And we know this government has run out of ideas on the cost of living crisis because the Prime Minister himself stood up in his first press conference at the start of the year, day one of the complete reset of the Albanese government, and said that, oh, by the way, we know cost of living is increasing and it's hurting families, so I'm going to ask Treasury and my department, PMC, to come up with some ideas to combat cost of living. So you're starting the year of your reset by throwing your hands in the air and saying, we've got no more ideas. So we've asked our departments for more ideas. So they're starting completely on the wrong foot here. But the first point to make on that is, why didn't they ask the departments 12 months ago about how they combat the crisis that is going on in cost of living? We know it's difficult to come up with effective policy that addresses inflation. We know if you add money in people's pockets, it adds to inflation, it pushes up interest rate. It's a difficult area to get right. But by starting the year talking about the fact that you've got no ideas, is completely the wrong way to go about it.
James Morrow, this wouldn't be so politically problematic for the Prime Minister had he not blamed Scott Morrison for the cost of living during the election campaign when he was in opposition.
Well, I mean, why wouldn't he? Because he's blamed Scott Morrison and the previous government for absolutely everything else that's gone wrong in the last 18 months. You know, that is the habit of the Albanese government. It's the pattern. Everything that goes wrong, it's the previous guy's fault. It was like that when we got here. Sorry, we're trying to fix it. But they can't actually do anything to turn any of this stuff around. You know, Andrew Carswell there was absolutely correct talking about inflation and how difficult this sort of stuff can be. But on another level, I actually think it's pretty simple. And yes, obviously, Albo has heard the message that supermarkets are unpopular. People are annoyed at them. I think it's actually more than just about the prices they charge. I think it's the way that they treat you when you walk in the door. They presume you're a thief when you're checking out. All of these sorts of things also get people offside. But beyond that, the bigger thing, too, I think, Sharri, is that, all of these government policies that the government has, they're making life more expensive. The energy transition is all about making things more expensive for people. Nobody believes this renewable stuff is going to be cheaper. Immigration is making rents higher. It's making the property market overheat. All of these sorts of things, pumping more money in than to fix all these problems. Again, that's inflationary. If they stopped doing what they're doing, it's almost sort of like a George Costanza sort of thing here. Take what your instincts are and do the opposite. And I think that's where this government needs to be right now.
Yeah, no, look, this issue is going to heat up in a major way when Parliament returns in the first week of February. Now, let's have a look at US politics. The American ABC News cancelled their planned Republican presidential debate after Nikki Haley refused to appear on stage unless Donald Trump agreed to the debate as well. As we know, the former president has yet to participate in any of the Republican debates so far. It had no impact on him sweeping the Iowa caucuses. Andrew, do you think that Nikki Haley and DeSantis should now stick with the contest in case Trump falls over, or do you think this is just a big waste of money for them?
I think it's another masterstroke by Trump here. What the last thing that Trump wants is some equivalence between candidates that he sees as deeply inferior, particularly as a former president himself. So he does not want to lower himself to a stage with minor players, particularly when the polls are substantially his way. Iowa was a masterstroke for Trump in being able to not only rally on the ground, it was an amazing ground campaign for those that followed it closely, but also to generate momentum of his own will. Without the help, in fact, quite the opposite of the mainstream media, he has generated this sense of momentum that is sweeping through these states. So this battle is Trump's to lose. There is no doubt about that. And he's managed to capture the imagination of the Republican base by really honing in on the three areas that they are concerned about the most: immigration, inflation, jobs going to China. And it just so happens to be these are the three areas that he performed most admirably during his presidency.
James, in the speech that he gave on the night that he had, swept the Iowa caucuses, he was very coherent in his campaign platform. He spoke about immigration, he spoke about foreign policy, claimed he could end the wars in Israel, no idea how, and also Russia and Ukraine. But his arguments that he laid out, you could see how they would be convincing to Americans who are having a tough time under Joe Biden, particularly when it comes to their own economic situation.
Well, I mean, it's not just, Sharri, that Bidenomics has failed. I mean, it has succeeded in some technical measures, but the average person on the street in America, they're dealing with far higher inflation, far higher prices that are never going to come back down again, by the way, than what they were enjoying 2 years ago before Joe Biden took office, or nearly 4 years ago before Joe Biden took office. But then beyond that, the stuff that Trump talked about, what he's doing here is positioning himself. He is now running as the de facto nominee. Nikki Haley can try and Bradbury this and hope that Trump falls over and that she somehow gets the nomination. She's going to scoop up a lot of big corporate money along the way to that, because there's a lot of big donors who like her and would like to see her be kind of, I guess you could say, almost a female Mitt Romney, running against Donald Trump here, who a lot of the big corporate donors do not like. But the stuff that he talked about in the speech, as you say, was very measured. It was about immigration, the out-of-control southern border. It was about crime in the cities, which is a huge concern for people, and especially, Sharri, in Democrat areas,
yes,
where those two issues go hand in hand. And then as well, the state of the economy and, of course, foreign policy. His point is, if he was still president, Putin would not have had the nerve to attack Ukraine, Hamas would not have had the nerve to attack Israel, and the world would be a much more stable place because he would have been a much more strong leader than Joe Biden, who has, I think you have to admit, shown weakness time and time again on every foreign policy front imaginable.
I think the most fascinating pick, if we assume that Biden is going to get the Democratic nomination, then the most fascinating question is who is going to be his VP. James, just very quickly, do you have a strong idea here? I mean, they're going to want to try find a woman. They can't possibly go with Kamala Harris again. So, I mean, is there any chance of Michelle Obama? Is there someone else they might be looking at?
On the Democrat side, I have no idea where they're going to wind up going with this, except that I do think that Joe Biden does possibly, come August in the Democratic convention, step down and become kingmaker for a younger president. What I've said since the beginning of this election cycle, Sharri, is the party that puts a young candidate out first will be the one to win this election.
We'll see. I think any candidate might be hard to beat Donald Trump, the way the polls are going in any case. All right, let's move on. Former All Black star Sonny Bill Williams has been cautioned by Channel 9 over social media posts that he made where he claimed parts of what happened on October 7 were a hoax. He said the fact that children were burned alive, that hostages were treated worse than animals, that women were raped by Hamas and killed in horrific ways were all untrue. We know those are all facts. He called it a Hamas rape hoax. Andrew Carswell, I mean, this is a pretty soft response from Channel 9. They've just spoken to Sonny Bill Williams and his management. I mean, how is that acceptable?
Well, I think, Sharri, this is confirmation of what we all know to be true, and that throughout his rugby career, Sonny Bill Williams got hit in the head many, many, many times. This is a clear indication of his IQ and the fact that he's let himself be led down the garden path by dangerous people and ideologues. Do I think he should be run out of town and cancelled? No, I don't. I'm a firm believer in the freedom of speech, even when you say dumb things, which he has on this occasion. So should he be cancelled? No. Should he be ridiculed?
But we're not talking about being cancelled. We're
Absolutely.
talking about a major media organisation continuing to employ him, pay him and back him. It's not saying he doesn't have freedom of speech as a private individual, but, I don't understand the media organisation side of it.
I just don't like it when people are targeted to be fired for silly things that they say. I mean, you could bring the ABC into that as well. We've seen that played out at this time as well. We saw it with the Qantas stewardess who had the Palestinian flag on her. Did she do the wrong thing? Of course she did. Does she deserve to be targeted to lose her job? Absolutely not.
But companies have policies, James Morrow, and we all have to abide by the policies, whether we like it or not, of our employer. And we know what the policies are. The ABC, they have a requirement to be impartial. It's in their charter. They receive taxpayer funding, and they don't receive taxpayer funding for the luxury of sitting on ABC platforms to express anti-Semitic views, as an example.
Yeah, sure. But I mean, look, there's differences between somebody who's working as a journalist for the ABC, which, as you say, is taxpayer funded and has a charter, and some lunkhead rugby player. I mean, the one thing I will say here, I agree generally with Andrew here, that canceling people, firing them for saying stupid stuff, I'm generally not in favor of, because I think it's much better to expose people when they say stupid stuff and then have it out and say, everybody, look how dumb what this guy is saying is. But I would say that in terms of the media response, or the response of the employers and so on, it is interesting to note this response versus, say, Israel Folau and how he was treated.
Good point.
You can imagine if he had said something like, the Bible does not call for gay marriage, or if he'd said something really controversial, like, men can't have babies, then he might be in more strife. And I think that, frankly, Sharri, is where, we should be talking about why some opinions that are contentious get treated differently than others.
Yeah, and I think that is a good point. There's a lot of hypocrisy here. A lot of people we've seen cancelled have been from the right, but, people who say very offensive, racist, anti-Semitic things on the left, well, there's no cancelling or even call for them to have any punishment at all. Now, farmers are demanding answers from the Bureau of Meteorology, which forecasted that the summer we've just had would be one of the hottest on record. We know that wasn't the case. This meant that cattle prices plummeted. Farmers took drastic action preparing for the extreme heat and drought that never came. Andrew, look, the Farmers Union has been scathing about this. They've accused Labor of dog whistling to the Greens and Teals about emissions targets and renewables while not giving any resources to regional Australia. You know, do you think this has been irresponsible from the Bureau of Meteorology, or should we just accept that you can't forecast the weather?
Well, there's always problems with forecasting. Let's not ignore that. But what this type of thing does is erodes the trust that Australians have in institutions, and particularly institutions where there is a link to climate policy as well. It is an erosion of trust. People get very sceptical about these type of outcomes because they think that policy has been designed or pronouncements have been made to sit alongside a certain ideology. So people are rightly pushing back against this and seeing it for what it is. But yet again, it's a failure for the government itself to understand what the effects of its policy designed for inner city electorates has on regional and rural Australia. There are dire consequences that happen from those policy shifts that they fail to recognise time and time again.
All right, James Morrow, Andrew Carswell, thank you both so much for joining me. Now, just before we go to the break, on Monday night, we demanded answers from Cricket Australia about what they thought of the decision of Cricket South Africa to sack their under-19s captain David Teagar because they couldn't guarantee his safety. That was the reason they gave. David Teagar is Jewish. It's clear they sacked him because he's Jewish, because he supports Israel. Cricket Australia never got back to us. They said nothing. Well, now Liberal Senator and former Ambassador to Israel, Dave Sharma, has written a letter to Mike Baird, the head of Cricket Australia, and he's demanding answers. Sharma asked that if Jewish cricket players are indeed at risk of attack, has Cricket Australia taken any steps to mitigate these risks for their own players? He asks, or are such security concerns made up and are instead a cover-up for political and religious posturing? Of course, if they are the latter, Dave Sharma rightfully insists that they should be roundly criticised by our National Cricket League. Dave Sharma is going to join me on the program tomorrow night. We'll see if Cricket Australia bothers to answer his questions. Now, after the break, Penny Wong meets with the families of Israeli hostages after failing to mention their release in a major meeting just a day earlier. Plus, China's ambassador to Australia doesn't mince his words when stating China's position on Taiwan. He let loose at Australia today in a rare public appearance. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Well, last night in Jordan, Foreign Minister Penny Wong announced aid for Gaza, but made no mention and no call for Israeli hostages to be released. Not a word. The Foreign Minister prepared statements to the media about what she intended to raise in her meeting with the Jordanian Deputy Prime Minister. The pre-prepared statement was posted on the DFAT website just minutes after her press conference, and this is what it read. It said Australia is gravely concerned by the worsening humanitarian situation in Gaza. Australia continues to call for the safe and unimpeded humanitarian access to affected populations and further humanitarian pauses to enable the scaled-up delivery of aid, safe passage for civilians and the release of hostages. We are working with our international partners to ensure desperately needed food and other assistance reaches those who need it the most. So those are the statements posted to the DFAT website. Yet here she was making nearly those same remarks, but curiously without the mention of the hostages. Have a look.
Obviously, we face, there is a dire humanitarian crisis in Gaza. His Excellency mentioned the UN figures which show the number of people in Gaza who are starving and those at risk of starvation. So we have a role to play as Australia, and we can also continue to provide assistance from afar.
Makes you wonder why Penny Wong failed to raise the release of the Israeli hostages while standing alongside the Jordanian Deputy Prime Minister. I mean, did she lack the courage to raise this important issue? She herself expressed solidarity with Israel and with hostage victims when she met with them and their family members in Jerusalem today. So why leave out this important point in the first major media address of the trip, and when in Jordan? Well, Shadow Minister for Defence Andrew Hastie joins me now. Andrew, what do you make of Penny Wong's approach to her trip to the Middle East, where she seems to be lecturing Israel when she's in Israel, but then doesn't raise the hostages when she speaks to members who are, on the other side?
Good evening, Sharri. Well, this fits with the pattern of leadership or lack thereof that we've seen from the Albanese government since October 7th. As your viewers would know, the Parliament came together in October and passed a joint motion through the House and the Senate condemning the attacks. But what we've seen from this government has been a slow response around the moral issues with October 7th. We've seen them slow to get to Israel itself. Penny Wong took a couple of months to get there. And now she seems to be equivocating when she's on the Jordanian side of the Jordan River, and that's a problem. And so this is really a precise time, and we need clarity here. October 7th was an attack by Hamas that was unprovoked, and it was cold-blooded murder. And this situation could be resolved fairly quickly if Hamas released those hostages. And so it was really important that Penny Wong made that clear last night.
Yeah, but instead there seems to be more priority to giving millions and millions and millions of aid that we don't even know whether it's reaching innocent Palestinians, civilians, and, or if it's being redirected by the governing body in Gaza, which we know is Hamas. Now, this morning, the Prime Minister said he wouldn't speculate on the South Africa's genocide case against Israel. The South African genocide case against Israel. He said he wouldn't speculate because it's an ongoing legal case that doesn't concern Australia. Have a look at his comments.
We're not participants in this. This is the actions of South Africa taking action at the ICJ. The Foreign Minister made clear Australia's position. That doesn't mean that we agree with some of the assumptions that are there in the South African case at all.
I mean, Andrew Hastie, why can't he just say very clearly that there is no genocide from Israel? Why does he have to weasel and mix and, have such complicated words like that? Just come out clearly and say there is no genocide from Israel. South Africa is out of line.
Well, that's precisely the point. There's a lack of leadership and a lack of clarity here. The Prime Minister is our national leader. We are a regional power. We do have a voice on the international stage. And it's important that countries like Australia are very clear on this. Israel is not committing genocide against Palestinian people. In fact, they're responding to October 7th, which was an unprovoked attack by Hamas, which saw the slaughter of innocent men, women and children. And we uphold the right of Israel to defend itself. Now, the Middle East is a very complex place, but if one thing is clear is that October 7th was an unprovoked terrorist attack. That's very clear, and Israel has the right to respond.
Absolutely, and thank you for your strong comments on this topic. Now, we know that Albanese's been cozying up to China. Well, China's ambassador to Australia, Xi Xian, made a rare public appearance at a press conference today, and he made demands of Australia that we stop interfering in maritime disputes involving the South China Sea and stop commenting on Taiwan's elections. Here he was.
We're ready to compromise. We're ready to show flexibility on many issues, for example, in trade issues. But on the question of Taiwan, there's no room at all for us to show flexibility or to make compromise because it involves China's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Because I noticed there are people in this country, I'm not talking about the government, I'm talking about the people. There are certain people in this country, or certain forces in this country who really have misunderstanding about the historical facts of Taiwan.
Well, another misunderstanding he spoke about was he denied there was any solar attack on Australian Navy personnel. I mean, Andrew, how can he make such a blatantly false claim?
This was a good case study in gaslighting, Sharri, because it's not a matter of supposition that the sonar attack on our sailors occurred. It's a matter of fact. I've had the briefing. It's very clear. So that's false. The sonar attack on our Royal Australian Navy sailors did occur. It's China who has blocked our exports. It's China who has detained Australian citizens without proper process. So for us to get a lecture is pretty rich, I must say. It's also China who's preemptively warned us about Taiwan. So I think we just continue doing what we do. We're friendly. We're a friendly country. We want relationships with everyone, including China, but always from a position of strength and always from a position of principle, which is very, very clear.
Mm-hmm. Look, just quickly before you go, you're obviously Shadow Defence Minister. How concerned are you about the Australian government's response to helping our US allies with this conflict in the Red Sea and the Houthi rebels?
Sharri, I think we've shown a lack of leadership here. For the last 30 years, we've always sent a naval vessel in support of counter-piracy or counter-terrorism operations in the Middle East. This government, the Albanese government, has broken with that tradition of 30 years. And so for us not to be doing the heavy lifting is, I think, pretty woeful. I just reflect on the US Navy SEALs, 2 of them, who were lost last week, and they're still missing in the Gulf of Aden whilst doing an interdiction of missile componentry that was headed for Yemen from Iran to assist the Houthi rebels attacking our shipping and our shipping lanes. So we're not doing enough. And this happened whilst we still don't have those promised ADF personnel in Bahrain yet. So this government is weak and they need to step up, and they're not doing their job in securing our interests.
Yeah, denying in December to send a warship over there. Now, just yesterday, we find out that instead of tripling the number of Navy personnel, it's just 1 or 2 office workers who are over there in non-operational roles as well.
And that's right, Sharri, and that's as the Navy is considering taking more of our frigates out of the water and putting them on the hard stand, reducing our overall capability, and again, making us a weaker country, because hard power does matter, and that's why this government should be investing more in it, not cutting defence as they are or have been since they've come to power.
Yeah. I've got to say, Andrew, it looks beautiful, the backdrop where you are now, so have a wonderful rest of your evening, and thanks for your time. Now, coming up, more Islamic hate in Sydney, with one Muslim cleric praying to Allah for Jews to be killed one by one. So you've got to ask, where are the intelligence agencies? Where are our authorities enforcing the laws that exist to prevent this hate speech? We'll talk about it after the break. Well, the Prime Minister has appeared to finally commit to bringing in the Stage 3 tax cuts in July that he promised during the election campaign.
On the Stage 3 tax cuts, are they going ahead, and when?
Well, we haven't changed our position on that.
Just last week, Albanese struggled to commit to the Stage 3 tax cuts, which kick in at $45,000. They were an election promise, but he's been unable to repeat that promise in recent weeks.
Can you promise to those Australian families the Stage 3 tax cuts will come into effect in July in full?
Well, we haven't changed our position on that, Michael.
I'll ask that question again. Can you promise, as you did before the election, the Stage 3 tax cuts will come in full in July?
Well, I've said we haven't changed our position.
But can you promise, Prime Minister?
Well, I've said I can't be clearer than that. We haven't changed our position.
That's not exactly a promise, PM. It was a promise before the election. Has that promise changed?
Yeah, you can play word games, Michael. Nothing has changed.
Many on the left are arguing that the tax cuts should be scrapped, and there might still be debate behind the scenes in the Labor Party about this. But the rationale for Stage 3 tax cuts has only increased, with Australians being pushed into higher tax brackets, paying more tax than ever before, along with the discontinuation of the lower to middle income tax offset. Now, if you look at the actual data, and according to the national account figures released in December, bracket creep and high income taxes are actually hurting people more than rate rises. It's quite amazing. Data shows that Australians have paid $18.5 billion more out of their pockets, 18.5, as a result of the rate rises, mortgage interest rate repayments. And that is massive, no question, $18 billion. But when you look at the total household tax take, that increased by $25.8 billion, a 40% increase. The ABC reported this in December, that interest rate hikes are hurting households, but there's a way bigger drain on our finances going unnoticed, your tax bill. All right, let's bring in now to discuss this former Labor MP Michael Danby and Deputy Leader of the Nationals, Senator Perrin Davey. Welcome to both of you. Michael, Albanese's language is that their position hasn't changed. I mean, we've all been around politics to know that that's what politicians say. Our position hasn't changed until the day it changes. I mean, you probably remember Malcolm Turnbull and Scott Morrison saying that about the Banking Royal Commission. They kept saying they're not having a Banking Royal Commission, our position hasn't changed. And then one day you wake up and they've announced it. So, you know, this is still different rhetoric from the election campaign when Albanese was clearly promising these tax cuts. Michael, do you think there is still a debate within the Labor Party, within Cabinet, about whether these tax cuts will go ahead, given they are pitched as being for wealthy people, even though, as I've said, they kick in at $45,000 and they'd help most average Australian families?
Well, there is that debate, but Albo, I'll have to be very careful because people who are earning $45,000 in a two-income family are not millionaires, and they know that bracket creep is pushing down their real disposable income. So it's something where ordinary working families should be considered, not the sort of left-wing agencies that sort of love a huge tax take and bracket creep so they can spend more on their required desires. You know, what they could cut back on the massive subsidies to energy, renewable energy. That might save the taxpayer hundreds of millions of dollars. So there's different ways of doing this if they have a budget problem. I don't think they do.
Well, they don't have a budget problem thanks to all of our taxes, thanks to exactly what we're speaking about here.
And the vast mineral royalties they're getting too.
And that as well, exactly. Perrin, I mean, I think those figures that I just spoke about before are quite astonishing, that bracket creep is hurting the average Australian more than rate rises.
Oh, very astonishing. And I think Albo's ambiguity on this, you're absolutely right. The fact that he can't categorically say that the tax cuts will apply from 1 July 2024, that's all he needs to say, and everyone can breathe a sigh of relief. But the wavering, the not answering questions, the referring to whatever his talking points on the day is, that my position hasn't changed. But as you say, we hear that from politicians all the time, and we've heard it from Albo before, when he promised he wouldn't touch superannuation, and he did. He promised that he would cut power prices, but he hasn't. And he says that his position hasn't changed until it does. And I think one thing we've got to remember, the people who are saying that we should scrap these tax cuts are using false economics. They're claiming that it doesn't help low-income people, but it does. They apply from $45,000 and it gives everyone on a sliding scale a little bit of tax relief so that it makes it easier for them to then deal with the rate rises, which is the other big hit to our back pockets. Yeah, exactly. Now, look, there was this exclusive story in the Australian today. Another Sydney-based Islamic leader has called for jihad in Australia. He told his disciples in Arabic that he prayed to Allah to kill Jewish Zionists one by one. Michael Danby, I do not understand why our laws, we have laws around hate speech in place, why the authorities aren't using them to stop this hate speech.
Why doesn't the New South Wales Police Minister get in a car with a protection convoy of New South Wales police officers, go out to that mosque, ask the man to come out and explain to him that this kind of rhetoric is inappropriate in Australia? simply a public demonstration of the power of the state, telling these people not to say this kind of inflamed rhetoric would have a calming down effect. If they won't even do that, why don't they invoke the 18C laws under the Discrimination Act? Where's the Human Rights Commission? Why don't they ring up these preachers and say, this is not within the spirit of Australian behaviour, and we will prosecute you under 18C unless you cease?
It's not even a question, in my opinion, in any case, of, racism or even anti-Semitism. It's a question of these are radical preachers, clearly. They have followers and they risk actually inciting violence. I mean, they're calling for jihad in Australia. There have been so many examples in both Melbourne and Sydney. Perrin, what do you think? Are you confident that our intelligence agencies, that our police, that our authorities have this under control?
Well, I certainly hope that our authorities are watching and monitoring all of these people, but I think that we need to do more publicly. I mean, where are the Labor politicians calling out this rhetoric and saying that it is intolerable? We had a Labor politician today try and lump at the feet of Peter Dutton and say it was Peter Dutton's fault that a Woolworths store in Queensland was vandalised because Peter Dutton had called for a boycott on Woolworths. And yet, where are Labor politicians today coming out to say that that sort of hate speech, that potential to incite violence, I mean, that is really far more, I mean, Peter Dutton made a comment about where people shop. Nothing to do with violence, nothing to do with hate, and he was called out by Labor politicians, and yet Labor politicians have been absolutely silent on this preacher who represents a minority of the Muslim views in this country, but who is absolutely calling out and requesting violence and, saying that he wants to see people die one by one. It is abhorrent. It should not be condoned. It should be condemned from the very top, and I haven't heard anything from Mr Albanese.
Yeah. No, look, it's like my mate Paul Murray says, the Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neill was very quick to come out and tweet about Donald Trump Jr., calling him a big baby, and yet she's been strangely silent on all these hate preachers. It just beggars belief. Michael Danby and Perrin Davey, I really appreciate you joining me tonight. Thank you. Now, after the break, the climate-obsessed, so-called independent Teals are now dreaming up a new green scheme that they think will win them more votes. They've had a very quiet time of late. We'll give you the details of their ambitious plans next. Welcome back. Well, Australia is already struggling to meet its Labor-set emissions target of 43% by 2030. And now some Teals are demanding a far more ambitious 75% by 2035. These independents say their traditionally blue ribbon constituents want real climate action. Well, the Australian's environment editor, Graham Lloyd, joins me now. Welcome, Graham. Look, is this a realistic target, or is this announcement today more for political purposes, seeing as the Teals appear to be struggling to get publicity at the moment?
Well, good evening, Sharri. Well, it's undoubtedly is political posturing, and it's part of a much bigger political game that's going on at the moment. I think the first thing to note is globally emissions are rising. The federal government has set a target that it's finding extremely difficult to meet. But suddenly we have this new debate about what we should do from 2035. The Commonwealth Government has an obligation to set a new target. The Teals have come out today and said they want one that's going to be much, much higher. And the opposition has been sending signals that it doesn't want to set a target. And this really is part of a calculation it needs to make, whether it takes the Teals on or whether it tries to, if you like, overtake the Albanese government in Queensland, in Western Australia, in Western Sydney, and leave the Teals seats to one side. The Teals are really running the same trick that they tried at the last election, and it's going to be fascinating to see if it's the same dynamic this time around.
Yeah, and this time we're in quite a deep cost of living crisis, so we'll see whether people care as much about the environment and these issues as they did last time. Now, very quickly, we've seen this issue of the Environmental Defender's Office emerge this week. These are the Greenie lawyers, taxpayer funded, by the way, threatening to squash more than $16 billion worth of oil and gas projects, mountains of litigation taking place. Look, the Abbott government didn't fund these Environmental Defenders Office. Labor decided to give them taxpayer funding. Where do you think this is going to end up?
Well, it's going to end up in court. I think the thing that has changed, as you say, is that there's always been legal challenges to development decisions. Now the government is funding the opposing side, so it's only going to become more acute. The danger, though, is that around the back, the environment movement is putting a lot of effort into having a climate trigger inserted into the new environmental laws. And then if that were to happen, this is where these legal actions are really going to bite. There's been publicity about a case involving Santos and an Indigenous claim over sea rights. That was really a claim of convenience. The main agenda for these groups is to stop fossil fuel developments.
Yeah, look, it's definitely a question mark whether taxpayer funds should be going to lawyers and litigation. Graham Lloyd, so good to see you again. Thank you so much. And that's all we've got time for tonight. Thank you for your company. I'll see you tomorrow night at 8 o'clock. Great show, as I mentioned, Dave Sharma on. But right now, here's my friend, Paul Murray.